Professor Wu, welcome back.
Thank you.
This is a sequel to the magnificent episode on what is decolonization. And you gave a very good description of where we are in the decolonization process. I thought since World War II, we've been decolonizing politically. And then more recently, the intellectual or cultural decolonization, which I believe that we're actually reaching a peak point now or very soon. So how do you feel about how we left up last time? I think it was a phenomenal introduction. We learned a lot from it. Our audience had a lot of questions. And so I want to actually turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. People who are familiar with post-colonial studies, theory and practice in social sciences fields usually know the name Edward Said, an English professor of Columbia University who died later by leukemia. He published a very famous book called Orientalism in 1979, which had been translated into probably 30 foreign languages, exerted huge influence on people's thinking about how the West created an image of the Orient, Orient in French, right? Or the East. How the East, for Edward Said, because he identified himself as a Palestinian because of his parents' background. He mainly focused on how Middle East or Arabic people or Palestinian people, how they and their culture was portrayed by Western travelogues, journalistic writings, literary works, how all of those works collectively contributed to a largely imagined image of the East. And the problem here is that we probably know it's probably human or universal, but sometimes I would think it's very, very Western way of thinking that divide people into two major groups, the self and the other. And that's also a sociological terminology, a dichotomy. Under this dichotomy, Western researchers, very often, we can also feel this in their daily language, that they always use the words we and they. We are West, the West. We are the West. They are non-West. So even in my college, in my department, historical studies are generally divided into two sections, Western history and non-Western history. Non-Western becomes a cultural category. In China, a history department is more like this: Chinese history, the world history. But if we compare these two, this classification, I'm not saying that Chinese system is perfect, but Chinese history versus world history, China is part of the world too. And this is in line with what we said last time. China and the world, the relationship has lots of tensions, but China is, by definition, part of the world. But a Western categorization is Western history versus non-Western history. And this is another binary categorization which enhance the students' feeling of dichotomy. There were two things, always two things in the world: polarized, the West and the non-West. And in this type of mindset, American students and scholars would very easy to create some myth, I think mythology, which can be also called academically essentialization. Essentialization means when you think of a group, you would always associate this group with a specific inherent character, and you believe they are always like that. This happens in China too. When we think of ethnic minority people in China, we would always think they are great drinkers, they are great dancers, That's essentialization. That's essentialization. In the meeting at in Atlanta about decolonization, I also had this self-reflection about Chinese. I said, yes, Chinese have that stereotype too. When I'm Han Chinese, but inside China, Han Chinese would always, sometimes, very often, imagine ethnic minorities as great alcohol drinkers and talented inborn singers and dancers. But I did my field work in ethnic minority areas for quite a few times. I met with lots of ethnic minority men who were not good drinkers. Their drinking ability was not even as good as mine. We break that stereotype and this essentialization. So what we can learn from this, even inside China, is that we shouldn't essentialize a group. If they are individuals, then they are individuals. One individual ethnic minority man might or might not be a good drinker. We don't know. Essentialization would also cause oversimplification. One great example here is a very typical American stereotype about Chinese culture. They would always describe Chinese culture as collectivism, and American culture was described as individualism. I have been long questioning the validity of this type of theory that largely oversimplify the cultural complexities. Lots of American scholars, professors in classroom will tell their American students Chinese culture is collectivism, while American culture is individualism. And I would always tell my students that's false. That's not true. Culture is always complicated. There's no such a thing that can be called Chinese culture equals collectivism. I have this documentary, which is very well made. It's called China's Century of Humiliation, where the filmmakers, typically I think American filmmakers or Western filmmakers, in their interviews, the interviewees always said Chinese culture is collectivism, American culture is individualism. Let's examine the terminology here. Collectivism is never a Chinese cultural word with deep cultural roots. If we look at ancient China, there is no collectivism. It doesn't even exist in Chinese vocabulary. In Chinese, contemporary Chinese, we call collectivism, it's 集体主义, 集体主义, translated as collectivism. This is a neologism appearing only in the 20th century. It did not exist at all in traditional Chinese culture. Lots of authoritative leading Chinese intellectuals, including Liang Qichao and many other modern scholars, from Enlightenment intellectuals like Liang Qichao to modern sociologists, through their field trip and their studies, would say that ancient China, its social structure would be probably better described as certain relationship and a dichotomy, not a dichotomy, but more complicated relationship between individual and the family. Family is the basic unit of rural China. Family. Historical research also shows that most of the time, Chinese family, even in ancient time, the size was small. 5 to 6 people lived in one family, or in a more precise Western terminology, we might call household. It's more exact Western terminology. Household means anyone who live under the same roof is called a household, rather than emphasizing their blood relationship. That's more accurate to describe ancient China. Then let's use this household, still the 家, okay, 家 or Japanese 爷. We use household. The average size of a household in traditional China was, the members were between 5 to 6. Individuals live in this family and feel lots of ties with the family and personal obligation, which was also emphasized, theorized by Confucianism. Only in the Song dynasty, 10th century, 11th century, philosophers like Zhu Xi, they started to largely artificially reinforce the idea of a large lineage clan that would gather probably several hundred people, dozens of households together as a group. And that's what's called in sociology and anthropology lineage. People who are related, but very often remotely by blood. We can call them relatives. Large clans, maybe like the Sun Yat-sen clan or the Zheng clan, if they live in one place for a long time, they gradually develop certain organization. They would engage in some charity activities. They have an ancestral hall where they are going to worship the common ancestor. But I must point out that this was also an invented tradition, invented in the Song dynasty by Neo-Confucian philosophers who wanted to enhance the belief in a large family, a large extended family, or a clan. So China did not have this so-called collectivism until the 20th century. And more precisely, I would say collectivism is a socialist theory and practice. Socialism. I would tell my students that 集体主义 or collectivism in China was more a contemporary socialist phenomenon related to a model of the Soviet Union, which means collectivism was more a modern Soviet-inspired system and ideology rather than intrinsically Chinese. Moreover, I wanted to emphasize China has lots of outstanding individuals. If we really want to use the word individualism, China never lacks individualism. We can, even if people are interested, Buddhism, 2 volumes that I just finished, the biographies of eminent monks called 高僧传. They recorded the life stories of lots of outstanding Buddhist monks in Chinese history. In the earliest several centuries when Buddhism just entered China, I read the whole 2-volume books, made a lot of notes, and what really impressed me was that all of those eminent monks in Chinese history, they were individuals. They were individuals with very different personality traits, and they were largely driven by their very individualistic aspirations. Some of them abandoned their family. Some of them abandoned their parents because of their deep devotion to the doctrines or the truth of Buddhism. Were they individualistic? Were they collectivists? These 2 categories probably didn't exist and shouldn't exist at all. Chinese history has seen lots of very strong individuals, lots of individuals in China who showed individualistic traits and pursued highly individualist objectives. That's a major challenge that I would have to collectivism, which is more like a contemporary Soviet-inspired Chinese culture, which did exist, like in sports. In sports, there's a team, there's a collective. When we grew up in China, there were a class which would emphasize collectivism. Yes, I'm not denying the existence, but there are a lot more Chinese. After you graduate from your school, you are very, very individualistic. You are just yourself. You are pursuing your personal dream. If we talk about collective, the feeling of a collective, I sent my son to Boy Scouts in America, where they emphasize collective too. Children will stand up as a collective and facing American flag and sing American national anthem. Where this sense of collective and sense of individualism entangled with each other, both in America and in China. That's my understanding. Thank you.
Very good, very good. And I would like to then go back to what you said, which is this creation.
Right. Yeah.
Of
Creation.
The creation of
myth. Yeah. Myth making.
And there's also a connecting point to all of this in here, because some people will say, well, why would you want to do that? And I would always recall the fact that the ends justify the means.
Mm-hmm.
Coming in from a situation that at that time, the West was not that sophisticated and did not quite have the economic might that it has today, but yet it had the desire to be able to be that. And so many times you need an ideology. In the old days, people used religion to create a joint unity. And so given the fact, perhaps, that the West did not have very much of a culture per se, and perhaps the West wanted to also have a means to be able to include others without including them completely, because, like you said, the self and the other is one way to be able to create a pseudo unity. We are we, and they are there, but together we are us, right?
Right.
And so then the other portion of it, now that you have a ideology of the we versus the they collected together, and that you have pictured through words, perhaps new words, perhaps invented words, to create an imagery of that. I think that Noam Chomsky would be one of those that would be a specialist in the creation of rhetoric here. And then, of course, to be able to get it to the populace, to the rest of the people, then you need to propagate it.
Yes.
Two people in here having a discussion about it is not enough. You'll be able to get everybody involved, and you also need some rites, rituals, habits, and customs to be able to join it together. For example, Thanksgiving celebration. Everybody eats turkey with jam, right? And stuffed turkey. And so I always get this question in China when I go to visit as to, well, how can you eat, a turkey? It's such a big piece of meat, and it doesn't have a lot of taste. And however, everybody during Thanksgiving talks about having the turkey. And so this propagation brings in the very interesting word, since we're talking about words. And the word that comes here is propaganda. Now, that's maybe a little bit of a voodoo word for some, but when you propagate through various means of channels of communication,
right?
Typically today was TV, but in the old days was probably just printed media.
Yes.
And the times of Zheng Guanying was definitely printed media. Radio wasn't invented yet. Today we have social media, and we can actually see it, groups of people with their own ideology growing very, very fast in their own social networks. So that is a fascinating thought. And also to the fact that this image that was created perhaps was not the real situation. And as you're describing, but again, it creates enough of the imagery of what China is for outsiders. Whereas what you're saying here is, if I hear correctly, in reality, if you ask somebody in China, they would not understand what you're talking about. And a third point I want to make mention is that the three principle, which is the ideology that Sun Yat-sen created to be able to make a revolution successful in China, was based on unity. Dr. Sun Yat-sen studied many of the political movements that was happening in the world. First thing, he mentioned that democracy was new, but he was actually seeing how the monarchy was switching over to other type of a governance. And he determined, or he asked, whether China to use like the French liberty and freedom.
Mm-hmm.
But he determined that China is actually, already has a lot of freedom and a lot of liberty in those days.
He said that. Yeah.
And in fact, he realized that that was the detriment, because he could not unite the people together. So how do you unite the people together? He also realized exactly what you said, which is in China, to be able to unite the people together, you have to address the fact that everybody was focused on the family.
Right. Liang Qichao said the same.
Not on the country. And to be able to unite everybody in here, we have to first address the fact that China was, at those days, centralized around the family. So that ideology, of course, carry on the revolution, which dealt with the issue of unity. And would you say that if unity is number one to be able to create a nation, whether this unity in here will be a way to decolonize, to colonize and fragment and divide to conquer?
Okay, if I understand your question correctly, I think Sun Yat-sen was not the only person who addressed this issue of sometimes for him the excess of Chinese individual freedom. And Liang Qichao noticed that the problem of China for Liang Qichao was a radical reformer, and who later turned to be pretty prone to embracing radical revolution. The Chinese word used by Liang Qichao, if the audiences include Chinese people or people who can understand Chinese, the exact word used by Liang Qichao is called 家族主义. He never used the term collectivism. So for him, the problem of Chinese people, the weakness, was 家族主义. I just translated it roughly as family or familialism. Isn't, anything isn't. Isn't is a very Western thing too. Liang Qichao called it 家族主义. And Sun Yat-sen wanted to transcend that too. He knew that Chinese people could be even overly individualistic, but in a negative way. Because you are so individualistic, and then you are becoming so family-centered, you do not have the bigger picture of the nation. You didn't feel that as a nation, people are actually connected. And there's another very famous book, a Western study on nationalism, which describes nation as an imagined community. You need that imagination, because in your life, you know your family members, you know the people from your village. They share the surname, or they might not share surname, because in many Chinese villages, people have 2 or 3 or multiple surnames. very big single surname lineage probably only exists in several Chinese provinces, coastal provinces like Fujian and Guangdong. In other provinces, one natural village would consist of lineages of several different surnames. Then your world, for a villager, you know yourself, some of your personal inspiration, you want to get rich, you want to make lots of money. If you watch the movie or read the novel, The Good Earth by Perlbach, a peasant wanted to get rich. That's his personal, individualistic aspiration. Or you want to bring glory to your family. But Liang Qichao and Sun Yat-sen's criticism for a more modern point of view is that while doing all those type of things, the Chinese people as a nation lacked that imagination, that there's a larger, higher level ideal, which should be for the whole nation. You should feel you are connected with someone who you don't know, because there is a nation, and that nation should be united as a group. Back to what we said the last time, they felt strongly for a sense of unity as a nation for China, because China was a weak and vulnerable semi-colony, or in the term, in the word of Sun Yat-sen, he would call China sub-colony, worse than a full colony, because the colonizers didn't even feel that obligation to help a full colony. And that's how Sun Yat-sen described the fate of China. So for him, China was even worse than a full colony like India, because the colonizers of China did not want to even fulfill the obligation as a good colonizer. They just wanted to get what they wanted. So that was the context that Sun Yat-sen and Liang Qichao were calling for the Chinese people to transcend individual on this level, transcend family on this level, to reach the higher imagination or imagine the goal of a nation. And here you, of course, need that sense of unity, or you as a nation, you should see all of the people, the so-called 400 million compatriots, right? 4万万同胞 as a collective. But what's wrong with that if we are talking about nationalism? Yeah.
So that's a very interesting point, because talking about going back in history, I was just recalling the fact that somebody says that the farther you look back in history, the further you'll be able to see into the future. And it was at one point in time that Genghis Khan was going all the way in his conquest toward the European side. And many people have asked why didn't go beyond. And one of the answers, I'm oversimplifying this, of course, is that because it was too backwards. It was not worth staying. And in fact, it reminds me of Zheng when he actually went and discovered the various places that he went to in there. And the question is, well, why didn't you just settle down and bring some development to some prosperity? Again, I'm oversimplifying in it just to stay on the point, but the answer to that was because it was too backwards. So coming back to what you're saying in here is that Sun Yat-sen realized that the status of China at that point in time, it was actually very bad, because nobody wanted to do anything.
Very bad.
China. Right. They would rather go to a place like India and perhaps Africa instead of coming to the even more sub-level economy of China.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, I want to go back to this individualism even more. We know in the American culture and political culture, in American people's mindset, individualism versus collectivism, these two words were already value laden, which means whenever American people talks about individualism, they already thought in their mindset that individualism is a good thing. Collectivism is a bad thing, because American culture, or at least American people's self-perception, would think individual freedom and individualism is something superior to collectivism. So this is not even an equal comparison. It's not equal comparison, which really fairly assesses the traits and the contributions of individualism and collectivism.
Well, going back to
this formula already hinting that individualism is something good, collectivism is something bad, is something should be scrutinized and criticized, because American people have already had an answer that we have individualism, and individualism is a good thing. You don't have individualism, you have collectivism, and collectivism is a bad thing, and collectivism should be accountable for lots of backwardness and bad things in China. So this simple formula already contains certain judgment there. That's even worse, because you can ask any American people, when they see these two words, they would intuitively think individualism is good, collectivism is bad, and then collectivism means China. Then what does that entail when American professors use these concepts to teach their American students? They are going to reinforce this stereotype. American professors, including those American professors who study China or they think they study China, are repeating this stereotype to their students that we are good, we are superior because we are individualism, and they are different, they were inferior, they are backward because they are collectivism. I hate to say that collectivism sounds nearly like a dirty word for American ears. Nearly so. So this is not even an equal, fair comparison of two isms. There is already predetermined judgment there. Individual is good, collective is bad. That's the problem of American education about China, including those documentaries where even Chinese were repeating this trope, this stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
We also need to think about one thing, sorry. In Confucianism, the analects, Confucius never taught different students in the same way. He taught all his students as individuals. He provided different individualized interpretation of the concept benevolence, or the Chinese word Zheng. He interpreted the concept Zheng differently for multiple times because he knew each individual student has different talent and capability of intellectual capability of understanding. So he provided a different interpretation of one concept to different individuals. The Buddha did the same. If you read Buddhism, there is a word in Buddhism that just emphasizes adaptive pedagogy, adaptive individualized pedagogy to just fit into that individual's talent and his intellectual capability. Then why would we wouldn't think individualized education, somewhat individualism, already deeply ingrained in Eastern civilization, including Confucianism and Buddhism?
And isn't that just around the same period where Guizhi was also teaching their own famous disciples very differently? And I recall that somebody did ask, well, why would you teach this person this way and the other person the other way? And the answer was pretty much the fact that it's based on their own individual situation.
It's true.
And that's very interesting because, of course, in most places that we're educated, I'm not sure today in China, but I would say that 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 is very rare that you will have a personal education, which brings out one particular fact is that you could create, of course, mass um, promotion easier than if you were to be able to do it on a individual basis. There's also another situation. I'm not sure whether you have followed it, but the aspect of the individual being good is only depending on the individual. If that individual is a high performance person, then of
Yes,
course
it's true.
that's
It's true.
going to get a high performance
Very-
result. But if you have one person who is not a high performer and that person wants to succeed, it may be better that he aligns with several people that are average,
Absolutely.
because then the
Absolutely.
selection of the average will give a better result than any one of the individuals by themselves.
Well, I think I totally agree. I hope our audiences include um, college professors who are teaching in American colleges. You are absolutely right that I think there's no way you can deny the fact that in American universities, not every student is equally self-motivated. Just as you said, some students are highly self-motivated, some are not. We shouldn't be, as educators, we can't pretend all students are equally self-motivated and equally brilliant. That's false. That's probably self-deceiving. We have to face the fact that in any colleges in China or in America, not all the students are the same. Some are much more self-motivated than others. But as you said, those self-motivated students can do very well without intervention. They know what they are doing, they know their goal, or they were probably influenced already by their parents. Students are influenced by their parents much more than by any professors and by colleges. This is another fact I think American higher education doesn't want to admit. Parents influence children much more than school and educators. Now, go back to this case, what you just said. Lots of students in modern colleges lack motivation and they lack goals. They become slackers in college. They, but because of this highly individualist culture and of course, legal protection of privacy, it's very difficult for educators to help students who really need help. Because yes, they are individuals, but they are not the best individuals. But if you want to help them, they are protected by lots of those concerns about privacy. Then it's very challenging for educators to even help them. You never know what happened to a student in his personal life. You never know what happened to his family. You never know the story behind an individual student who is obviously a not a very successful student, not competent. You
But
can't do anything.
but perhaps the perhaps the aspects of the motivation
Mhm.
or the description and explaining that a student that everything is really based at the end of the day on motivation. You cannot motivate an individual unless the individual motivates itself. And
Correct.
if the person is not motivated, he may not develop the ambition. If he does not develop the ambition, he will not care whether China is what is being painted, or whether he or she would want to go find out what really China is all about.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so, of course, there is the aspects of the desire to be able to create an ideology, to be able to unite a particular country. I'm talking about from the point of view of before the colonization process began, and utilizing, like what you're saying here, words to be able to create images, the we versus the they, etc., etc. And these would be the means to an end to be able to create that unity of we, so that you can actually have the division of the day, the others. Okay. And
Yes.
if that is happening in here altogether, we're really talking about several hundred years in the process of being able to have that ingrained. That by itself is almost a culture that has been created, the habits, the thinking, the vocabulary. How will you go about rewriting the vocabulary? Now, I would just relate it to my profession, which is in computer electronics. Even today, although electronics doesn't have any more that since 1960 at best, but maybe 1980, 40 years in the process, the vocabulary, if you were to change it, the whole digital world will come to an end. So in other words, it cannot occur, cannot happen. The better aspects of it is, of course, what would create the motivation for people to realize that the world has changed?
Yes.
And
Yes. The
what
word.
would it create the motivation for the people to say, wait a moment, China has changed?
Yes.
And then if they realize that there's a change for the better, then maybe they will start seeking. And like any major aspect, I do believe that people can change a system. Either you change it from the bottoms up, or you can change it from the top down. But in this particular case, there's a big vacuum. I go back to some of the work of Ray Dalio, who is more of a capitalist, but in his later days, he's turned to be a bit more involved in documenting principles of success. And one of his principles of success comes into coming up with formulas to be able to measure the progress, the decay, and the advancement of various societies or countries in the world. To some extent, that is his business. He invests in countries, so he needs to know which countries are going up, which countries are going down. One of the measures of his system and earlier measures is the thing that changes before you start going backwards, is the educational system. Because obviously, from the time that you take a kindergarten student until the person becomes a productive force, you're talking about 15, 20 years into the future. And so you could actually see what you're doing today to the educational system, and how that system is creating individuals that 20 years later, once it reaches 20 years, it's very difficult to change. And that's the whole point. So the motivation of the professors are easily aligned once there's a motivation of more students. So the question is, how do you get the students to start realizing that, well, or the world in general, that China has changed?
Yes, that's true. That's very true. Yeah, that's about how the students can basically break away from American commercial mainstream media's coverage about China that largely biased, exaggerating China's problems, and exaggerating the economic relationship between China and America, blaming China for stealing American jobs. But those were not new, because I read a Japanese economist English writing published in 1970s. The Japanese scholar already wrote extensively to criticize American media for blaming Japan for creating that large trade deficit. He was saying that, no, those were not Japanese export to America. Those were American companies that made things in Japan. And when I was reading this book, I said, this is just what exactly happening in America today. So it's just old trick. American government and media blame everyone all the time. 40 years ago, blamed Japan. Now blamed China, but all for the same reason. The American vested company produced the goods in Japan, or they produced goods in China, and then those goods were transported back to America to be sold to American market. That's all about. It's more like a foreign trade statistics. Do you think those were Chinese goods, or they were fundamentally American goods but processed in Japan and in China? The Japanese scholar already found this problem 40 years ago, and he already wrote it. So it's just an old trick.
Well, the on a business perspective, and let's use Nike and Adidas as an example. One of the largest factory in China producing for Nike and Adidas happened to be within the family's region, and the costs or the profits that stayed in China for that Nike and Adidas shoes was 100 renminbi, which is roughly about what is that? $10, $20, $10.
20, yeah, 20, 15 maybe, $15.
So $15 would be the profit, but that shoes, the profit margin in the United States would be in excess of $150.
Right.
So who gains more? And of course, if you ask Nike and Adidas whether they would rather just bring back the crop to be able to sell in the United States, well, there's no way that you can actually make a profit margin of $150.
Well, yes, but the problem here is that most of American ordinary people, including students, would not do this calculation. They would not ask the question you asked: who gained more? Who gained more? How many Chinese workers earned their how they were paid? Where did the profit go? Who earned more? Who gained more during this whole process of globalization? American students or American people in general did not dare to ask this, because they didn't dare to direct their criticism to those big companies and bigger capitalists.
Well,
it's easy to find a scapegoat in China, maybe.
Going back to the educational curriculum altogether, I would say that if you're not focusing your curriculum into mathematics and numbers and economics, and instead of that, you are focusing in something that is more esoteric, then of course the students and the people in general will not know how to go compute something. Now, I happened to start visiting China in the mid-'80s, and I realized that even kids that were in first or second grade could negotiate and can very quickly come up with numbers in different ways.
Yes, true.
And in fact, if you are looking at the social media today, you could actually see very simple comparisons, just the way that I mentioned about Nike and Adidas. Those are elementary. Everybody knows that, and everybody will follow that from that perspective. But I see that the West, unfortunately, doesn't have and has lost that ability. And so going back to your issue, yes, there needs to be an improvement in the educational system. I've been an advocate after translating Chen Guanying's book in it, because Chen Guanying does talk about the educational system that China was going backwards, and he was actually,
yeah, of course.
so
Yeah, China
of
needs
course
educational reform too.
different places always have different solutions because the people are different. And I'm not suggesting that you read the Chen Guanying book and you follow exactly how Chen Guanying is referring to the educational system that was good. However, with that said, Chen Guanying did study various countries' educational system, and he emphasized the fact that whatever education needs to be put into practice. As you will recall, he was speaking particularly about German educational systems,
Yeah.
where the schools, the trade schools, would be very close or next to, or maybe even some businesses and factories would have their own a trade school and educational school to be able to create better workers.
Yes, that's true. Okay, I think one thing what you just said interested me was that about the language and words, because I'm not an economist either. I'm not a math person either. I'm more a language and a literature person. I used to publish a short fiction. So one example or two examples about language, about words. From these two examples, we can also see the recent Chinese attempt to use Chinese words to re-understand China. Number one, everyone knows Confucianism. Use the name of the founder to name the school, the philosophical school, is also very Western. Marxism, Maoism, Confucianism, if you are considered as the founder, your name will be there like a label, a trademark. A group of Confucian scholars, both Chinese and overseas Chinese and American scholars, have already suggested a new name brand for Confucianism. They call it Ruism, because we know Confucianism in Chinese language and in Chinese culture itself is always known as 儒家, 儒家, Ru family. Ru can be broadly translated as scholar. So 儒家 can mean a scholarly community, scholarly family. This group of scholars have a Facebook group where they renamed Confucianism into Ruism. Ruism. They try to convince more people to accept Ruism instead of Confucianism, because Ruism means it's a group project, not only Confucius himself. We know there were monks, Xunzi, there are many people added to that, to this. At least it is an attempt to rename it by using Chinese word. Another very recent attempt is the word Tibet. Tibet is a very Western word too. Some very recent Chinese social media has already renamed Tibet into Xizang. It's just that original Chinese word used in Chinese context. In China, it's called Xizang 自治区, translated as Tibetan Autonomous Region. TAR in English, TAR, Tibetan Autonomous Region. But now there has been increasing loud voice in China calling for renaming Tibet to Xizang. Just call it Xizang Autonomous Region. Just try to understand and make Western audiences understand what Xizang means and why Tibet should be renamed Xizang, and understand the concept and all this background as such. I'm not totally agreeing with those things, including Ruism and the renaming effort of Xizang and the Ruism thing. Personally, I have not been fully convinced, but I just want to demonstrate that there are earnest efforts in China and internationally to rethink those Western concepts, Western words like Confucianism, Tibet. They can be Ruism by invoking the original Chinese word and the concept, 儒家, the Ru community, scholarly community, rather than Confucianism, which make it sound like a religion. No, it's not a religion. It's not also only about Confucius, the personality. If we call it Ruism, we change the whole way of thinking. If we call Xizang, rather than Tibet, the whole picture might be changed because the lots of things are behind those two different names, cultural connotations, political meanings.
Well, this is actually very appropriate. One concept that we have in design, and we're talking about disruptive design. And this is a word that is used a lot because just the fact that the digital world has disrupted most traditional businesses like e-commerce and Amazon just created a new way for people to do business. So to that extent, there is a so-called mechanism by which is not a sequential progression of it, because sequential progressions take a very long time. To some degree, you could actually say that Sun Yat-sen just took an orthogonal, something that nobody thought about, because normally you would take down a dynasty and you just create a new dynasty under your new name in China.
Yes.
And Sun Yat-sen just pretty much chopped it, one day and said, no more dynasty, no more kings, no nothing. Right. So one way, of course, to be able to do a disruptive process in it is to be able to do it like you're saying, which is from a completely different angle, not to adopt the vocabulary, because it takes too long to be able to explain how do you arrive at this vocabulary and how that vocabulary is contrary to the other vocabulary and that in there. And instead of that, in fact, although you may or may not like the word Ruism, it makes a lot of sense.
Right, it makes lots of sense.
People think, well, wait a moment, what happened to Confucianism? Right? It says it's called Ruism. So, and that's a real word. And by the way, the words that you had there is an invented word, is an old one, doesn't exist, never existed. Go to China, it doesn't exist. The real word for that is this. And I believe that people, again, going back to the motivation, you have to start from the fact that people have to say, well, wait a moment. This idea that China is a backward country, I don't buy it anymore. And these are the photos of whether Shanghai or even Chongqing or, any of the even small provinces in China have changed completely from what it was. And so once you realize that, then you actually can start saying, well, maybe I should learn a little bit more of what real Chinese is all about. And we'll start with Pinyin. Now, in our old days of learning Chinese, we will learn Cantonese. We learned it at home. And the best Cantonese that you could learn outside of China, I believe that was the Yale system or one of those systems of pronunciation. That was a standard way to Romanize Chinese until China came with the standardization of Pinyin. And Taiwan had its own Popomofo, you may recall, which I thought that was interesting, but it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is because you had to go memorize a new set of characters to later another set of characters. Right. And so, again, in China, if you need to learn Chinese, most Western people start with the Pinyin, which is the romanization portion of it. And as you're learning Pinyin, you're learning something completely new. And then at that point in time, you introduce the fact that all of the provinces in China, including the autonomous one in here, one of them is called Xinjiang. And oh, by the way, in the West, you used to call it Tibet, but that doesn't exist in China. It says, oh, I get it. And then one by one, people said, well, this is the real thing. Because now, especially in 2023, 2024, people really are seeking for the real thing.
Yeah.
People now are realizing, like what you're saying in here, if 5 years ago we were to have this discussion, not only about decolonization, but about the fact that some of the words in here don't make sense and they were invented, most people would actually not believe it. And because right now in 2024, everybody is disbelieving everybody, I believe that not to point at any government, all governments have to be secretive. All governments have to be secretive. We don't say that governments are not telling the truth. Governments have to keep their own secrets. That's the nature of government. You cannot blame them for that. Okay. It's also the misunderstanding of people. In fact, it is because the government have to be secretive and have to explain to the people something that is secretive. It will end up explaining something that is completely different, perhaps wrong. So I don't believe that you could blame that in the system. That's the way that it works. It also always has worked. Okay. And so one possible solution, going back to the after there is the interest brought up in it, then the next portion of it would be to be able to utilize a set of new vocabulary to be able to come about with it. I believe that's a very, very good observation. It is also a fascinating continuation of the decolonization. And because if the decolonization occurs, and we're not talking about a revolution or anything, we're talking about a natural process that is occurring, natural.
Right.
You cannot stop
cultural, intellectual process. Yeah.
and you cannot stop it. That's the point. You either jump into the bandwagon. That will be my selling point. We're not talking about pro or con. If you want to have a good life, you should probably adopt what is actually best for you. And what is happening in good places in here, just go and check it out. And in that process, because I believe that we also, during the time of colonization, the territories that actually did benefit a lot from colonization, because in those days, the Western teachings and the Western modernization and industrialization had a lot to offer. Let's just take a look at the fact that how even the steam engine or today the computer is saving people's time, energy, and work. You could be living a life rather than sweating, your whole life. In the old days, Indian families in here, the wife was spending the whole day, or several wives would spend the whole day just to be able to cook the meal for the family. Mm-hmm. But now, because of industrialization and the benefit of it, there's a lot more productivity over the last 2 decades. 2 centuries altogether. Right? But now there's also reaching a plateau. It's reaching a natural plateau. Okay. And very clearly, things are shifting from one side of the West to the East. So the motivation for anybody who is smart is that if you're really looking for, why don't you just check it out and you'll be surprised.
Yeah, yes, that's true. Yeah.
Professor Wu, I think that again, you have
thank you, Mr. Yeah.
started a incredible continuation of
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation. Yeah, it was a great, exciting conversation that really made me think a lot too. I have been reflecting on many of those things too. It really helps me think. Thank you.
Thank you again.